Every one of us is tasked with bringing the world to perfection. This week's Parashah reveals a secret to help us do just that. After opening Parashah Chukat with the mysterious laws of the red heifer, we return to the narrative of Bamidbar, the narrative of the Jewish people in the desert. But somewhere between the story of Korach and last week's Parsha and the story continuing this week, 38 years have passed. The Jewish people are now in their final year in the desert. The entire generation that sinned with the spies in Parsha Shalach have died, and the next generation have taken their place, about to start their final march into the Promised Land. Miriam, in whose merit the Jewish people miraculously had water to drink these past 39 years, has died, leaving the people without water. How do the people react? You guessed it. They complain against Moshe and Aaron. They say, if only we had perished when our brothers perished at the insistence of Hashem. Is that a fair complaint? For that matter, what exactly is their complaint? You see, after the people sin with the spies, Hashem decrees that the nation will wander in the desert for 40 years until all the adult males who came out of Egypt, other than Joshua and Caleb, have died. The Midrash fills in the details of how they are to actually die. Every year on the anniversary of the sin of the spies, which was Tisha B'Av, all the adult males would dig their own graves and sleep in them. Some wouldn't wake, and those who did would cover up the graves of those who did not. Then they would repeat that again the next year. Those that died at the insistence of Hashem died painlessly in their sleep. But now, after the last of that generation have all died out, the next generation find themselves without water and is worried about dying of thirst, a horrible way to die. So they cry out, if you were going to kill us as well, why couldn't you decree that our deaths be as painless as our fathers? Why did we need to die of thirst? So back to my question. Is that a fair complaint? On the one hand, sure, the possibility of dying of thirst is really scary, and you really can't blame the people for speaking out. Ideally, they should have had emunah, should have had trust in Hashem. But it's hard to blame the people for crying out of fear. But on the other hand, the complaint doesn't end there. What happens next? We read, why have you brought us into this wilderness for us to die there? Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place, a place with no grain or figs or grapes or pomegranates? This is the same complaint we've seen multiple times since leaving Egypt. Remember how good things were back in Egypt? Why did you take us out of Egypt only to have us die in the wilderness? This is the same complaint, but with one important difference. This is not the generation that went out of Egypt. Sure, some of them may have been children at the time of the Exodus, but the majority of the nation at this point would have been born in the wilderness. Those complaining never experienced Egypt. They didn't leave Egypt. They knew nothing of the foods of Egypt. So why are they longing for Egypt and its food? Where did the language of this complaint come from? It came from their parents. They grew up hearing their parents constantly complaining to Moshe about leaving Egypt. Anytime anything bad happened, they heard, Moshe took us out of Egypt for this? Chaverim, my friends. Children hear how and what their parents are talking about, what they are complaining about, and it shapes their worldview. You had an entire generation of Jews who immigrated to Canada and America before and after World War II. They would find a job. They would find a job on a Sunday, work the week, and when they refused to work on Shabbos, they would get fired and have to find a new job and begin over on Sunday. They wouldn't dream of working on Shabbos, but every Shabbos, after getting fired again, they would say, it's hard being a Jew. A generation of children grew up hearing it's hard to be a Jew over and over and over. Is it any wonder that so many jumped at the new doors that opened if they were willing to scale back their commitment to Jewish practices? So many of that generation abandoned Jewish observance, but they all grew up experiencing the highs of the Six-Day War and the fears of the Yom Kippur War. The Jewish identity was still very strong, albeit a little quiet. For the past 30 or 40 or even 50 years, it's no longer hard to be a Jew. In fact, for most of us who grew up in Canada or the US, these past 50 years, it's been easy to be a Jew. arguably the easiest time to be outwardly Jewish in thousands of years. Sadly, today, we're seeing we're seeing the next shift, an inversion, in fact. It used to be easy to be culturally Jewish, but hard to be a practicing Jew. Today, it's easy to be an observant Jew, but since October 7th, identifying as a Jew has gotten harder. Anti-Semitism, unions, universities, professional associations, and public schools all turning against their Jewish members. It's tempting to hide our Jewishness. But the generation who grew up hearing it's hard to be a Jew has stepped up in ways that surprised even them. But what about their children? The children who grew up in a world where being Jewish just wasn't an issue. A world where every door was open to them. A world where Israel wasn't a newly reestablished country that needed the support of world Jewry. A world where Israel was a powerhouse on the world stage. This is my generation. We stepped up in the face of the blatant Jew hatred and Israel bashing in the mainstream of our society. But the hard part comes next. The hate marches in the streets will eventually die down. But the people who are so passionate about the evils of Israel, Zionism, and Jews don't just vanish. Their hate will fuel the return of the quiet anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that makes it harder to find a job if you have a Jewish last name. Anti-Semitism that makes it hard to get into a university if you have Jewish-themed volunteering on your application. How we choose to respond to this will shape the next generation's relationship with Judaism and Israel. Our children are watching. If we tuck in our Magen Davids, remove our Jewish volunteer work from our resumes, hide our support for Israel at work, and let out a sigh when we get home saying it's hard to be a Jew or it's hard to be Zionist, how can we blame our children when outward Jew hatred on the streets flares up again in a decade or two or three? How can we blame our children when they don't have the courage to stand up? Will it be easy? Not always. Can I say that outward support for Israel will never cause you to lose out on a potential job, a friend, or other opportunity? No, I can't say that. But ultimately, we need to have emunah. We need to have trust in Hashem. Trust that Hashem will restore sanity in the world. Trust that if we live as proud Jews, all of this will work out. So we need to be proud to be a Jew. Be proud to be a supporter of Israel. Be proud that our ancestors, despite their complaining in this week's Parashah, followed Hashem into the land of Israel 3,500 years ago and have been there ever since. And make sure our children see that pride, because they are certainly watching. That is one thing we can learn from this week's Parashah. How will you step up this week to bring the world a little closer to perfection? Shabbat Shalom and Am Yisroel Chai.